Tacky old woman, my daughter-in-law shouted across the table, loud enough for every guest at my grandson's birthday dinner to hear. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break, it settled. The room went quiet in that strange, uncomfortable way people fall silent when they know they've just witnessed something they shouldn't have. The clink of silverware stopped. Even the little ones, moments ago laughing over frosting and balloons, seemed to sense the shift in the air. I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, the linen napkin still resting across my knees exactly where I had placed it. 72 years old, and I had hosted more family dinners than I could count, set more tables than anyone in that room, remembered birthdays, anniversaries, preferences, allergies. And yet, in Jessica's eyes, I was just that. Tacky. Old. Disposable. I lifted my gaze slowly and looked at her, really looked this time at the sharpness in her smile, the way her hand rested possessively on Daniel's arm, as if she had already claimed everything that used to be mine. My son didn't say a word. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he let out a small, awkward chuckle, the kind that tries to pass something off as harmless when it's anything but. That sound told me more than any words could have. I nodded once, as if acknowledging a simple comment about the weather. Then I reached for my water glass, took a small sip, and placed it back down with care. No trembling. No ruse. Just quiet. Across the table, someone shifted in their seat. My neighbor Carol, who had come out of courtesy, glanced at me with something like pity. I didn't return the look. I didn't need pity. Not tonight. Not ever again. The cake sat untouched at the center of the table. White frosting piped in delicate swirls, my grandson's name written in blue icing just slightly off-center because my hands weren't as steady as they used to be. I had baked it myself that morning, measured every ingredient, preheated the oven to exactly 350 degrees, just like I had for decades. Jessica had insisted on ordering one from a bakery. Something modern, she had said. But Daniel told her mine was fine. Fine. Pressed my fingertips lightly against the edge of the table and pushed my chair back. The legs made a soft scraping sound against the hardwood floor. Not loud, but enough to draw attention again. "Excuse me," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. I walked through the dining room, past the framed photos lining the walls, each one a memory I had once believed meant something. Daniel as a boy, missing his front teeth, grinning up at me from the front porch. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor. Family vacations where we all squeezed into one car because it was cheaper that way. I paused for half a second at one picture in particular, my late husband standing beside me in front of this very house, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling like we had just built something that would last forever. Then I kept walking. The kitchen was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator steady and familiar. I rested my hand on the counter for just a moment, feeling the cool surface beneath my palm. From the dining room, I could hear voices starting up again, low at first, then louder, laughter returning in hesitant bursts, as if the evening had simply hit a small bump and was now continuing on its way. Jessica's voice rose above the others, light and carefree, as though nothing had happened at all, as though I had already been erased from the room. I straightened up and glanced at the small calendar pinned beside the fridge. Today's date was circled in blue ink. I had marked it weeks ago. Wrote Ethan's 7th birthday dinner in careful handwriting. I had planned every detail. I always did. My reflection caught in the microwave door, faint but clear enough. Silver hair pulled back neatly. Pale blue sweater. The same pearl earrings my husband had given me on our 30th anniversary. For a moment I studied that reflection, not with sadness but with something else. Recognition, maybe. Or clarity. Tacky old woman, I repeated under my breath, testing the words as if they belonged to someone else. They didn't. They never had. I reached for the drawer beside the sink and opened it slowly. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it. Organized. Predictable. Mine. I closed it again just as gently. Out in the dining room, someone began singing Happy Birthday, their voices uneven but cheerful enough. I listened for a second, then turned toward the hallway that led to my study. Each step felt measured, intentional, not rushed, not uncertain. Whatever they thought I was, whatever they believed they could reduce me to with a single sentence shouted across a dinner table, they were wrong. And the most dangerous part for them was this. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to defend myself. I was going to let them keep talking. Let them keep showing me exactly who they were. Because by the time I was finished, they would understand something far more important than whether I was tacky or old. They would understand exactly whose house they were sitting in. I closed the door to my study without making a sound, the soft click of the latch barely audible beneath the distant laughter drifting down the hallway, and for a moment I stood there with my hand still resting on the brass handle, as if I needed that small point of contact to steady myself, not because I felt weak, but because something inside me was shifting into place with a clarity I had not felt in years, the kind of clarity that comes when all illusions finally fall away and what remains is simple and undeniable truth. I moved slowly toward the desk by the window, the same desk where my husband used to sit every evening balancing checkbooks and reviewing paperwork with a patience that always amazed me, the surface still polished, still organized, just as I had kept it after he passed, because some habits do not disappear, they become anchors. I pulled out the chair and sat down carefully, smoothing the fabric of my sweater as I did, and for a few seconds I simply listened, the muffled sound of voices rising and falling, the occasional burst of laughter, the clinking of forks against plates, life continuing just a few rooms away as if nothing important had happened, as if a line had not just been crossed that could never be uncrossed. I reached forward and opened the top drawer of the desk, the motion familiar, almost automatic. Inside were neatly stacked folders, each labeled in my own handwriting: insurance, property tax, utilities, documents that most people would consider tedious, but to me they represented something else entirely: years of responsibility, of consistency, of keeping a household running without anyone ever having to ask how it was done. I slid one folder out and placed it on the desk, then another, taking my time, not rushing because there was no need to rush anymore, not tonight. I could still hear Jessica's voice in my mind, sharp and careless, and Daniel's silence beside it, heavier than any words could have been. And I thought about how many small moments had led up to this one, moments I had dismissed at the time, explained away, chosen not to examine too closely because it was easier to believe in harmony than to confront the slow erosion of respect. There had been the afternoon last spring when I found my favorite set of china packed away in a box without anyone mentioning it, replaced by something modern and minimal that Jessica preferred. There had been the time Daniel suggested I should consider simplifying things around the house, his tone gentle but distant, as if he were speaking to a neighbor rather than his own mother. And there had been the quiet way decisions began to happen without me, plans made, invitations sent, changes implemented, all with the assumption that I would simply adapt, because I always had. I leaned back slightly in the chair and let out a slow breath, not a sigh of sadness, but something closer to acknowledgement, like closing a chapter that had already ended long before I realized it. I opened the first folder and flipped through the pages, the numbers and signatures familiar, my husband's name appearing in careful print alongside mine, documents we had signed together, decisions we had made side by side. I paused at one page and ran my finger lightly along the edge, remembering the day we had finalized it. Sitting across from a lawyer in a quiet office, my husband insisting on clarity, on making sure everything was exactly as it should be. You never know how people change, he had said back then, not with bitterness but with a kind of practical wisdom that I had nodded along to without fully understanding. Now, years later, those words carried a different weight. I closed the folder and set it aside, then reached for another, the one labeled with a date from just a few months before he passed, the paper inside crisp, untouched since the last time I had reviewed it. I did not open it yet. Instead, I rested my hand on top of it and looked out the window, the backyard dim in the evening light, the old oak tree casting long shadows across the grass, the same yard where Daniel had played as a boy, where we had hosted barbecues and birthday parties and simple Sunday afternoons that felt like they would stretch on forever. I could hear the final notes of the birthday song now, followed by applause, a child's laughter, the scrape of chairs as people stood up, and I imagined Jessica smiling brightly, cutting the cake I had made, accepting compliments as if she had orchestrated the entire evening, as if effort and care could be reassigned just as easily as furniture in a room. I turned back to the desk and finally opened the second folder, my movement steady, deliberate, as I began to read, not with urgency but with purpose, because whatever came next was not going to be decided in that dining room. It was going to be decided here, quietly, carefully, and on my terms. I read the document once, then again, slower the second time, letting each line settle in my mind the way my husband always taught me to do when something mattered, not skimming, not assuming, but understanding every word for exactly what it was. The legal language was precise, almost cold, but beneath it there was intention, and I could feel his voice in it, steady and certain, making sure there would be no confusion, no room for interpretation by anyone who might try to twist things to their advantage. I placed the paper flat on the desk and smoothed it gently with my palm, as if it were something fragile, though in truth it was the strongest thing in this house, stronger than raised voices, stronger than silence, stronger than whatever plans had been forming without me over the past months. I could still hear movement in the hallway now, footsteps passing by, a door opening and closing, the faint echo of Jessica's laugh drifting closer for a moment before fading again, and I imagined her moving through the house with that same easy confidence, as if every room already belonged to her, as if ownership was something you could claim simply by acting like it long enough. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly, not to escape, but to think, to trace the pattern that had been forming. Long before tonight, there had been the conversation 2 weeks ago when Daniel mentioned a real estate opportunity in passing, his tone casual, almost rehearsed, as if he expected me to nod along without asking questions. There had been the brochure Jessica left on the kitchen counter just 3 days ago, a glossy pamphlet for a senior living community, all smiling faces and manicured gardens, positioned just carefully enough that I would see it, but never discussed directly, and there had been the way they both avoided my eyes when I asked simple questions about future plans, their answers vague, their attention always shifting somewhere else. At the time I had told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into ordinary changes, because that is what you do when you love people, you give them the benefit of the doubt even when something feels slightly off, but tonight had removed all doubt. There was no misunderstanding in the words Jessica had chosen, no accident in the way Daniel had chosen not to respond. I opened my eyes and looked down at the document again, at the signatures at the bottom, my husband's name written in the firm, confident hand I remembered so well, and beside it mine, smaller but steady, a quiet partnership captured in ink. I reached into the drawer once more and pulled out a small envelope, one I had not touched in months. Inside was a business card, slightly worn at the edges, the name printed clearly across the front, the attorney who had handled everything for us, a man who had sat at this very desk once, explaining each clause with patience, making sure we understood not just what the documents said, but why they were written that way. I turned the card over between my fingers, considering it, not with urgency, but with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar, as if I had stepped into a version of myself that had been waiting quietly beneath the surface all along. Outside, the noise began to shift again, chairs scraping, voices moving toward the living room, the rhythm of the evening changing as the formal part of the dinner gave way to something more relaxed. I could picture it without seeing it, Jessica guiding people, Daniel following her lead, everything flowing around them as if they were at the center of it all. I stood up slowly, holding the document in my hand, and walked to the bookshelf against the far wall, running my fingers lightly along the spines until I reached the small wooden box tucked neatly between 2 volumes. I opened it and placed the document inside, then closed the lid with care, not hiding it but preserving it, because some things are not meant to be left out in the open until the right moment arrives. I turned back toward the door and paused, listening once more to the sounds of my family moving through the house, and for the first time that evening, I did not feel like I was on the outside of it, looking in. I felt like I was standing just behind a curtain, watching a performance unfold, waiting for the exact moment when the truth would step onto the stage and change everything. I reached for the light switch and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into a soft, quiet shadow. Then I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, my expression calm, my posture steady, as if nothing at all had changed, even though everything had. I stepped into the living room as if I had only been gone for a moment, the air warmer there, filled with the sweet scent of cake and the low hum of conversation that carried on without interruption. No one turned to look at me right away, and that told me everything I needed to know about how easily I had been dismissed, how naturally they had continued without me. Jessica stood near the coffee table, holding a plate and smiling as she handed out slices of the cake I had baked, accepting compliments with a gracious nod, her voice light, almost musical, as if the sharp edge from earlier had never existed. Daniel stood beside her, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other holding a fork, laughing at something one of the guests had said. His posture relaxed, comfortable, at ease in a way I had not seen around me in a long time. I moved quietly to the armchair near the window and sat down, folding my hands together in my lap once more, observing, not participating. The children ran back and forth across the room, their laughter genuine, untouched by the tension that had passed between the adults, and I felt a brief flicker of something soft at the sight of my grandson. His face lit up with joy, completely unaware of the undercurrents shaping the evening. That innocence, I realized, was the only pure thing left in this room. Everything else had layers now, intentions hidden beneath smiles, decisions made behind closed doors. I watched as Jessica leaned slightly toward one of the guests, lowering her voice just enough to suggest something private, something important. And though I could not hear the words, I recognized the gesture, the subtle way she positioned herself as the center of attention, as the one who controlled the narrative. It was not new, I had seen it before, just never with such clarity, never with the understanding that it was not accidental. It was deliberate, practiced, effective. Daniel glanced in my direction once, briefly, his eyes meeting mine for less than a second, before shifting away, and in that fleeting moment I saw something there, not guilt, not quite, but discomfort, as if acknowledging me required more effort than he was willing to give. I did not hold his gaze, I simply looked past him, letting the moment pass without weight, because there was no need to chase something that had already chosen to move away from me. Someone approached and offered me a slice of cake, their smile polite, their tone careful, as if they were unsure how to navigate around me now. I accepted it with a small nod and placed the plate on the side table without taking a bite, the frosting gleaming under the soft light, untouched, perfect, much like the version of this family I had held on to for far too long. Across the room, Jessica laughed again, louder this time, and I noticed how easily the others followed her lead, how quickly they adjusted to her rhythm, her energy, her presence. It was almost impressive, the way she had woven herself into the fabric of this household, not by force, but by persistence, by knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work for her. I shifted slightly in my chair, my back straight, my expression calm, and let my eyes move slowly around the room, taking in every detail, every interaction, storing it away with a quiet precision that surprised even me, because for the first time, I was not looking at this as my home filled with my family. I was looking at it as something else entirely, a structure, a system, a place where roles had been reassigned without my consent, and yet the foundation beneath it all remained unchanged, unseen but intact. I could feel it now, steady and solid beneath everything they were building on top of it. Jessica finally noticed me then, her gaze flickering in my direction for just a second, her smile tightening ever so slightly before she turned back to her conversation, and in that small reaction, I saw the first hint that she understood something was different. Not in the room, not in the evening, but in me. I did not react, I did not acknowledge it, I simply remained where I was, quiet, composed, present, because there was no need to interrupt what was unfolding. Not yet. Timing, I remembered my husband saying once, is everything, and tonight, for the first time in a very long while, I was willing to wait for the right moment. I remained in that chair longer than anyone seemed to notice, long enough for the room to settle into a rhythm that no longer included me, long enough to see the patterns clearly instead of through the soft blur of habit and hope. Jessica moved through the space with quiet authority, adjusting details, guiding conversations, placing herself exactly where she needed to be so that everything appeared effortless, and Daniel followed that current without resistance, his laughter coming easier when directed toward her, his attention drifting further from me with each passing minute. I did not interrupt, I did not insert myself, I simply observed, because observation, I realized, reveals more than confrontation ever could. At one point, Jessica excused herself and stepped into the hallway, her voice lowering as she answered a phone call, and without thinking, I rose from my seat and moved slowly in that direction, not with urgency, not with suspicion, but with the same quiet pace I had carried all evening. I paused just before the corner, not close enough to be seen, but near enough that her words reached me clearly in the stillness of the hall. "Yes, we are almost ready," she said, her tone calm, controlled. "I just need a little more time to convince him it is the right move." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "No, she has no idea, she still thinks everything is staying the same." I stood there, my hand resting lightly against the wall, feeling the steady surface beneath my fingers as her words settled into place, not as a shock but as confirmation, the kind that removes the last trace of doubt. "The house will be listed by next month," she continued. "Daniel is already on board, he just does not want to deal with the conversation yet." Another pause, her voice dropping even lower. "The community brochure helped, she saw it, but she did not say anything, which means she is thinking about it." I closed my eyes briefly, not to block it out, but to absorb it fully, every word, every assumption, every carefully constructed plan that had been unfolding without me. Once she agrees to move, everything becomes simple, Jessica said. We sell, we split, and we move forward. The call ended a few seconds later, the soft tap of her phone against her palm followed by the sound of her footsteps returning toward the living room, and I stepped back silently into the shadow of the hallway, allowing her to pass without noticing me, her expression composed, her smile already returning as she re-entered the space filled with guests and laughter. I remained where I was for a moment longer, the quiet of the hallway wrapping around me like a barrier between two worlds, one loud and bright and full of performance, the other still and clear and entirely real. I opened my eyes and looked down the length of the corridor, toward my study at the far end, where the document rested inside the wooden box, untouched, waiting, and for the first time that evening, I felt something close to certainty settle deep within me. Not anger, not hurt, but direction, a steady line connecting what I had just heard to what I already knew. I turned back toward the living room and walked in again, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral, as if nothing at all had shifted. Jessica glanced at me briefly, her eyes searching my face for something, perhaps a reaction, perhaps a sign that I had heard, but I offered her nothing, only a small, polite nod before taking my seat once more. Daniel was speaking to someone near the fireplace, his voice animated, his gestures relaxed, and I watched him for a moment, seeing not the boy I had raised, but the man he had chosen to become, shaped by decisions, by influence, by the quiet acceptance of someone else's plans. I lowered my gaze to my hands, resting calmly in my lap, and allowed the noise of the room to fade into the background, because everything important had already been said, just not to me, and that, I realized, was their mistake, not because I needed to be told, but because they believed I did not already understand. They believed silence meant ignorance, when in truth, it had given me the space to see everything exactly as it was, and now that I had seen it, there was no need to rush, no need to confront, no need to explain. There was only one thing left to do, and it would not happen tonight, not in front of guests, not in the middle of a celebration. It would happen when the room was quiet again, when the voices were gone, when the performance had ended and only the truth remained, and when that moment came I would be ready. The evening began to wind down slowly, the way gatherings always do. Not with a clear ending but with small signs that only someone paying attention would notice, coats being quietly retrieved, empty plates stacked near the sink, conversation shifting from lively to polite, and I remained exactly where I had been, still, composed, watching it all unfold with a patience that no longer felt passive, but intentional. Jessica moved toward the front door to say her goodbyes, her voice warm and gracious, thanking each guest as if she had hosted the entire evening herself, and perhaps in her mind, perhaps she believed that presence alone was enough to claim ownership, to rewrite the story of who built this home, who maintained it, who carried it through years that no one else seemed to remember anymore. Daniel followed her lead, shaking hands, offering small smiles, his attention fixed outward, never once turning back toward me, not even in passing, and I noted that absence carefully, not as something to resent, but as something to remember, because absence, like action, reveals truth. One guest approached me before leaving, her expression hesitant, her voice lowered as she said, "It was a lovely evening," and I nodded in return, offering a quiet thank you, because politeness, unlike respect, can still exist even when everything else has shifted. Eventually the front door closed for the last time, the soft click echoing through the house in a way that felt louder than it should have, and for a brief moment there was silence, not the uncomfortable silence from earlier, but something deeper, heavier, like the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath all evening. Jessica turned from the door and looked around, her posture relaxing now that the audience was gone, and Daniel let out a small sigh as he loosened his shoulders. The performance had ended, and what remained was far more honest. "That went well," she said, her tone satisfied, already moving toward the kitchen without waiting for a response. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it did," he replied, though his voice carried less certainty, as if he were agreeing out of habit rather than conviction. I rose from my chair slowly, the movement drawing their attention for the first time in several minutes, and for a brief second both of them looked at me, not with warmth, not with concern, but with something closer to expectation, as if they were waiting for me to say something, to react, to confirm whatever version of events they had already decided was true. I did not give them that. Instead, I walked past them calmly and into the kitchen, where the remains of the evening sat scattered across the counters, plates with half-eaten slices of cake, glasses with melting ice, crumbs where children had been too excited to sit still. I picked up a dish towel and began to wipe the counter slowly, methodically, the motion familiar, grounding, and behind me, I could feel their presence linger, uncertain. "You do not have to do that tonight," Daniel said after a moment, his voice careful, as if choosing the right tone might fix something he could not quite name. I did not turn around. "I have always done it," I replied simply, my voice steady, neither warm nor cold, just factual. Jessica stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "We can talk about everything later," she said, her words measured, almost rehearsed, and I paused briefly, the towel still in my hand, before continuing the same slow motion across the counter. "There is nothing to talk about tonight," I said, and this time I did turn, meeting her eyes directly, not with confrontation, but with a calm that left no space for argument. She held my gaze for a second, then looked away, just slightly, and in that small shift I saw it again, that flicker of awareness, the first real crack in the certainty she had carried all evening. Daniel glanced between us, his expression uncertain, as if he were standing at the edge of something he did not fully understand, and I let the silence settle between us, not forcing it, not breaking it, because silence, when used correctly, does more than words ever could. After a moment, I set the towel down neatly on the counter and walked past them toward the hallway, my steps unhurried, my posture unchanged, and as I moved away, I could feel their eyes follow me, not with dismissal this time, but with something else, something quieter, something closer to unease, and I knew then that the balance had already begun to shift, not in a way they could see yet, not in a way they could name, but in a way that would soon become impossible to ignore, because what they thought was control had always been built on something they never truly understood, and now for the first time I was no longer willing to let them believe it belonged to them. I closed the door to my bedroom with the same quiet care I had used all evening, not out of habit, but out of intention, because every movement now carried weight, every small action part of something larger that had already begun to take shape. The house felt different once the noise had faded, the walls no longer echoing with laughter or conversation, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of settling wood reminding me that time was still moving forward. I walked to the dresser and removed my earrings, placing them carefully into the small porcelain dish I had used for years, the soft clink grounding me in something familiar, something unchanged. Then I sat at the edge of the bed, my hands resting lightly on my knees, and allowed the silence to settle fully around me, not as emptiness, but as clarity. Downstairs I could hear faint movement, the low murmur of voices, Jessica and Daniel speaking in tones too quiet to make out, and I did not need to hear the words to understand the conversation. I had already heard enough, more than enough. I leaned back slightly and let my gaze drift across the room, taking in the details that had once felt permanent, the framed photographs, the neatly arranged books, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, each piece a reflection of years that had been built slowly, carefully, without expectation of recognition, and yet now, those same years were being treated as something temporary, something transferable, as if a lifetime could be repackaged into a decision made over dinner. I stood up after a moment and moved toward the closet, opening it just enough to reach the small safe tucked discreetly behind a row of coats, my fingers moving with practiced ease as I entered the combination. The soft click of the lock releasing felt louder in the quiet room. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it, documents, records, items that most people would never think about until it was too late. I took out a single folder and held it in my hands, feeling its weight, not heavy but significant, because what it contained was not just paper, it was structure, it was protection, it was the line between assumption and reality. I carried it back to the bed and sat down again, opening it slowly, not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted to feel it, to remind myself that what I had heard earlier in the hallway was built on nothing more than belief. Belief that I would agree, belief that I would step aside, belief that I would remain silent in the way they had grown accustomed to. I turned a page carefully, my eyes moving across the familiar lines, the language precise, the intent unmistakable, and I thought about how easily people confuse kindness with weakness, how quickly they assume that patience means permission. Downstairs, a door closed, footsteps moving across the floor, the house settling further into the night, and I imagined Jessica standing in the kitchen, reviewing the evening, confident that everything was moving according to her plan, confident that the next steps were already decided. I closed the folder and rested it on my lap, my fingers lightly touching the edge, and for the first time since the evening began, I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement, not of what had been done to me, but of what I was about to do, because this was no longer about reacting, it was about timing, about precision, About choosing the exact moment when assumptions collapse under the weight of truth. I stood once more and returned the folder to the safe, closing it with the same careful motion, then shut the closet door, leaving everything exactly as it had been, unchanged on the surface, hidden beneath. I moved to the window and looked out into the darkened yard. The outline of the old oak tree barely visible against the night sky, steady, rooted, unmoved by whatever passed around it, and I felt something similar settle within me, not anger, not urgency, but a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. I turned off the light and let the room fall into shadow, then walked to the door, pausing only briefly before opening it again, because tomorrow would come, and when it did, nothing on the surface would seem different, the same house, the same routines, the same expectations, but beneath it all the foundation had already shifted, and they had no idea, not yet, but they would soon enough, and when they did it would not be loud, it would not be dramatic, it would simply be undeniable. The next morning arrived without announcement, the way ordinary days always do, soft light filtering through the curtains, the quiet hum of the house waking up around me, and I followed my usual routine with careful precision, not because I needed routine, but because routine creates the illusion that nothing has changed. I made coffee, measured exactly as I always had, 2 level scoops, water filled to the line, the familiar scent filling the kitchen as if it could erase what had been said the night before, but it did not. It only reminded me how many mornings had begun just like this, unaware of what would eventually unfold. I set the table for one, placing a single cup, a single plate, my movement steady, deliberate, and as I sat down, I noticed the quiet, not empty but expectant, as if the house itself was waiting upstairs. I could hear movement, footsteps crossing the hallway, a door opening, then closing again, and a few minutes later, Jessica entered the kitchen, her expression composed, her posture confident, as if she had already decided how this day would go. "Good morning," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful, and I looked up at her, offering a small nod. "Good morning," I replied, my voice even, giving her nothing more. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register that something was different, then continued, reaching for a mug, pouring herself coffee without asking, as if the space belonged to her completely now. Daniel followed shortly after, his presence quieter, his movements slower, as though he had not slept well. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away, focusing instead on his phone, scrolling through something that seemed far more comfortable than meeting my eyes. "We should talk today," Jessica said after a moment, turning slightly toward him but loud enough for me to hear, her tone measured, controlled, as if she had rehearsed this line. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, we should," he replied, though there was hesitation beneath it, a subtle pause that suggested uncertainty. I took a sip of my coffee and set the cup down carefully, the soft sound against the table drawing their attention for just a moment, but I did not speak. I let the silence remain because silence forces people to fill it, and Jessica did exactly that. "We have been thinking," she began, her voice smooth. "About what might be best moving forward for everyone." I looked at her then, not interrupting, not reacting, simply allowing her to continue. "This house is a lot to manage," she said, her eyes briefly scanning the room as if evaluating it. "And there are options that could make things easier." "Easier," I repeated the word silently, considering how often it is used to disguise something else entirely. Daniel shifted slightly beside her. "Mom, it is just something to consider," he added, his voice softer, almost apologetic, and I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "I see," I said, nothing more. Jessica's expression tightened just slightly, the lack of resistance not giving her the footing she expected. "There is a community nearby," she continued. "Beautiful place, very comfortable, a lot of amenities." I listened, my gaze steady, my posture unchanged, and as she spoke, I could hear the same words she had used on the phone the night before, the same carefully constructed narrative now delivered directly, but still based on the assumption that I would follow along, that I would accept the version of reality they had already built. I reached for my napkin and folded it neatly beside my plate, the motion small, controlled, and when I looked up again, both of them were watching me, waiting, expecting a response that would either confirm their plan or challenge it, and I gave them neither. "That sounds like something you have thought about carefully," I said, my tone calm, neutral, offering recognition without agreement. Jessica blinked once, her confidence wavering just slightly. Daniel shifted again, his weight moving from one foot to the other, the room holding a tension that had not been there before, not loud, not obvious but present. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with the same quiet care I had used the night before, and carried my cup to the sink, rinsing it under warm water, the simple action grounding the moment in something ordinary, something real behind me. I could feel their attention sharpen, waiting for what would come next, but I did not give them a confrontation. I did not give them resistance. I turned off the water, placed the cup on the rack, and dried my hands with a towel, each movement deliberate, measured, and when I finally turned to face them again, my expression was unchanged, my voice steady. "We can discuss it later," I said, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. Jessica opened her mouth slightly, as if to push further, then stopped, something in my tone, in my posture, in the absence of emotion, shifting the dynamic in a way she could not quite control. Daniel looked between us, uncertain, as if he were beginning to sense that the conversation was not unfolding the way they had planned, and I walked past them without another word, moving down the hallway toward my study, leaving them standing there in the kitchen, their plan spoken aloud, but not accepted, not challenged, simply placed in the open where it could no longer hide behind assumptions. And as I reached the door and rested my hand on the handle, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed this was the beginning of a conversation, but in truth, it was the beginning of the end of theirs. I closed the door to my study behind me and did not rush to sit down. Instead, I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle into the corners of the room, because this was the only place in the house where nothing had been rearranged without my knowing, nothing had been assumed, nothing had been taken. I walked to the desk and opened the drawer with steady hands, taking out the folder I had already read more than once, the paper inside unchanged, but now ready to be used, not as protection but as truth. I picked up the phone beside the lamp and dialed the number from memory, each digit deliberate, each pause intentional. It rang twice before his voice answered, calm, professional, familiar. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, as if he had been expecting the call all along, and perhaps he had. "Good morning," I replied, my voice even. "I would like to set a meeting today." There was no need to explain further, no need to justify the urgency. He understood, people like him always do. "Of course," he said. "I will be available at 11. I glanced at the clock on the wall, just after 9. "Enough time, more than enough. That works," I said, and after a brief exchange of details, I placed the receiver back into its cradle with the same quiet care I had used all morning. Outside the door, I could hear movement again, footsteps pacing, voices low, Jessica and Daniel speaking, their tones no longer as confident as they had been earlier. Something had shifted, they could feel it, even if they did not understand it yet. I opened the folder once more and removed a single document, the one that mattered most, the one my husband had insisted be written clearly, without ambiguity, without loopholes. I held it in my hands for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the man who had known, long before I did, that clarity would one day be necessary. Then I placed it into my handbag and closed it, the sound of the clasp snapping shut, final, decisive. I walked out of the study and into the hallway, my steps measured, my posture straight. Jessica and Daniel were in the living room now, their conversation stopping the moment they saw me, the air shifting again, heavier, more aware. "I am going out for a few hours," I said, my tone calm, not asking, not explaining, simply stating. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice controlled, carefully neutral. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I replied. And for the first time since the night before, she did not have an immediate response. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "Do you need anything?" he asked, his voice uncertain, and I shook my head once. "No," I said, "nothing more." I turned and walked toward the front door, reaching for my coat, slipping it on with practiced ease, the fabric settling around my shoulders like something familiar, something that still belonged to me. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, the sky clear, the street quiet, and as I closed the door behind me, I did not look back, not because I was leaving, but because I was returning later on my own terms. The drive was steady, unhurried, the roads familiar, the buildings passing by without drawing my attention. Because my focus was not on where I was going, but on what I was about to confirm. The office was exactly as I remembered, clean, quiet, unchanged, and when I sat across from him once again, the document placed between us, there was no confusion, no delay, only clarity. He reviewed it carefully, then looked up at me with a small, knowing nod. "It is still fully in effect," he said. "Nothing has been altered, nothing has been transferred." I listened without interruption, allowing the words to settle, to become something solid, something undeniable. "And the clause?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It applies exactly as written," he confirmed. Any attempt to remove you from the property or pressure you into relinquishing it results in immediate forfeiture of any future claim. I nodded once, not surprised, only certain now, completely certain. I closed the folder and stood, thanking him with a quiet sincerity that did not need to be expressed in more words. And when I walked back out into the daylight, everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because the house would still be there when I returned, the same walls, the same rooms, the same people waiting inside. But the difference now was simple. They believed they were preparing me to leave when in truth they had already stepped outside of what was ever theirs to begin with, and by the time they understood that, there would be nothing left for them to claim, not because I took it away in anger, but because it had never belonged to them at all.